It's been a pretty interesting week. First, we got the UFO hearing on Wednesday, and then bam! The next day, AARO dropped their yearly UFO report, and there's some things we gotta talk about. I'm very excited for today because helping me out is the co founder of the Debrief, Micah Hanks. I'm gonna bring him in right now. Micah, it's so good to see you. How are you?
It's wonderful to be here. I think we're overdue for one of these. And as you can see, like Dale Cooper, all right, I am trapped inside the Black Lodge where time sort of means a little less than it does in other places. Now, I know we're working on some of the Doctor Who references. Do you get the Twin Peaks reference?
Of course.
Ah, there you go. So anyway, but yeah, I mean, we all feel kind of like we're in the Black Lodge right now, given all the weirdness that's been going on over the last few days. Quite an eventful week, my friend, wouldn't you say?
It oh, it is. And you know what? I'm loving it. I felt like earlier this year it seemed a little dry with UFO news, and then near the end of the year, which is consistent, we get bombarded with all of this stuff, and the AARO report snuck up on me. But see, you have people that you know when you chat with and they give you a little bit of tidbits. Did you know this report was going to come out before it did, or were you shocked like me?
The AARO report. So yeah, I did know it was going to come out only a few minutes before it dropped because
And you didn't call me?
I know, right? Yeah, I know. I'm going to have to get better about that. Obviously, she keeps telling me this, folks. I've got to clue you in a little bit more quickly on these things so that we can get on the mic. But yeah, the ever diligent Debrief team, which by the way, Cristina here is Debrief alumni. Once you're a member, you're always a member. And so you've kind of, been in our periphery and having helped us really since around the time of our launch. But certainly when this report was about to drop, we had begun to get word from people. Hat tip to Chrissy Newton also for very quickly flagging me in our chat and saying, Micah, big news is about to come down. And of course, this is right before our weekly newsletter. So those who subscribe to the intelligence brief already got a quick kind of recap. But really, I would say that the analysis of the report, I mean, a short 18 pages, that's a little longer than some that we've seen in recent years. But still, there's quite a bit, I think, still to unpack in this report. And again, some very notable references to things like UAP following aircraft, shadowing, I think was the term that they used, and also 20 or so cases that are currently still under review because they're intriguing enough that AARO officials are still wanting to try and understand what they might mean and what technologies, if any, they could represent. So yeah, for me, this was quite interesting.
That's good to hear because people have had mixed feelings about the previous reports that we've gotten, even the volume 1 that we received in March. We're still waiting for volume 2. The last year's annual report, people were pretty darn disappointed, specifically Christopher Mellon. And then he, in his tweet last year, he's like, read the debrief article. And what a shout out right there. This time around, you also wrote a summary article on the debrief to give people an understanding of what this report is about. Something that caught my attention was the term jellyfish shaped craft. It's been trendy. I feel like the right word to use is trendy in 2024 from Jeremy Corbell releasing his stuff, and then just people becoming more knowledgeable on these type of craft shaped objects that have been happening since the late 1940s into the 50s. And while they're a little bit more sparse in shape, we have seen them in the past. And for it to come up again compared to all the other reports where it's never shown up, I found that interesting. And I feel like it displays that those that wrote it, including John Klotsky, the new chief of AARO, is definitely keeping an eye out in UFO news, which he should be. But that word jellyfish seemed strategic. Do you think so, or just casual coincidence?
Well, it's a little hard to know at this point. I think what I would say about the interesting placement of that term within the new report is primarily that there is a long history of jellyfish being used as a term to describe UAP, and whether or not that is an accurate description of how these, phenomena appear, what they may represent, that's anybody's question. Again, I think what it really comes down to is people often when they see something, and I know this personally from just, spending time in nature, and when you initially see an animal, is that a bear? Am I looking at a wild boar? Am I looking at, something else? You start going through in your mind, what are the possibilities? What are the knowns that I can liken that to? And so when we see something as sometimes not only anomalous, but even amorphous, as some UAP are described as being. In other words, sometimes they don't necessarily have any particular shape. They even can change shape based on some witness descriptions. We're left grasping for ways to describe it. And I actually have found that in UFO literature going back many decades, jellyfish is a fairly common, maybe not the most common or best known, but it is a fairly common descriptor that some have used to try and describe the phenomena that they're observing. And in fact, I can just tell you that friends of mine and I, going back more than a decade, have joked about jellyfish UFOs. We had laughed about a particular photograph that appeared, I believe, in a Danish publication back in the 1970s or the 1980s. And it literally seemed to show a large jellyfish hanging in the sky. What the official explanation was that this was a smoke cloud that was produced like by a smokestack on a factory, and that this smoke cloud arose from the smokestack, and that as it was beginning to dissipate, it had the tendril-like tentacles coming down, and it gave the appearance of a jellyfish. Someone saw this, photographed it, and said, "Look, there's a UFO. It's like a flying jellyfish." And so we laughed about that for years. Lo and behold, then we had this video come out just a while back, which is, again, apparently a authentic video, and it does appear to show an object that, at least in the video, it seems to resemble a jellyfish. Theories about what it may be range from a cluster of balloons to possibly also being, to put it eloquently, bird excrement on the reticle. Whatever that actually may be, the superficial appearance led to, I think, a reinvigorating of the debate about jellyfish UFOs. And again, it's unclear at this point whether what is mentioned in the new AARO report that dropped just yesterday is in reference to that video or another sighting of a UAP that some military personnel presumably likened to a jellyfish. But at least for my own part, having looked at this for a long time, that's not exactly something new for many of us. It remains in question whether the video that recently dropped, however, has any relationship to the recent mention of a jellyfish-type UAP in the AARO report.
That's a very valid question. And we're going to be getting into the report, doing the nitty gritty kind of fun stuff. I'll be sharing my screen here on that report. But before we do that, Laura, thank you so much for the $10 super chat for the ramen and popcorn fund. You know, I love ramen and popcorn. It is
That's
so
right.
good. And fun fact, popcorn has a lot of fiber in it. So the more you know. I'm going to share my screen here so that we can talk about this AARO report, because not everyone's read it as of yet, which is disappointing. And yet I'm also not surprised because, like many of you, it snuck up on me. And so we're going to get into that today. And we are very lucky to have Micah here, who has read it thoroughly and even wrote about it for the debrief. But I want to start off with this first question, and it's actually I'm going to back it up just a little bit to the hearing that we just got on Wednesday. Gallaudet had just barely spoke about AARO. What did he say that kind of caught your interest during the hearing?
Well, yeah, if you happen to see me on News Nation, this was one of the key things that I pointed out bright and early yesterday before the sun rose. Literally, if you see me drinking coffee here, it's because I've gotten very little sleep over the last 48 hours, having very unusual hours as I've continued to try and provide, reporting and analysis on this, Cristina. But that said, yeah, while we were discussing that bright and early yesterday morning, one of the main things that stood out to me was Gallaudet not only saying that he had gone to meet with officials with the All-domain Anomaly Resolution Office. Keep in mind, for anyone at home, most of them, I'm sure, are following all this, but I still hear from people frequently who say, what is this all-domain thing you're talking about? This is the Pentagon's official UAP investigative office. You might call it the new Project Blue Book. And it's been in operation for, round about a couple of years now, but it is also the successor to a previous official effort going all the way back to 2022 called the UAP Task Force, which was initially led by Jay Stratton. The former director of the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office was Sean Kirkpatrick. Its current director, whom you referenced earlier, Dr. John Kozlowski. And the AARO investigations continue to produce what I think, frustratingly for some, is very conservative language with regard to UAP and how to characterize the phenomena. Now, some, like Rear Admiral Tim Gallaudet, who was one of those providing testimony during the hearing earlier this week in Washington, he again is very explicit. When asked during that hearing, what do you think these things might be? Both he and former counterintelligence agent Lou Elizondo, also providing testimony, they both said, we think that this could represent essentially a form of non-human intelligence. And so Gallaudet earlier this year apparently went and he met with AARO officials, came away from what he said he expected would be a fairly short meeting. He said after several hours, feeling like it had been more akin to an influence operation. In other words, he felt he had been brought in and they spent a fairly lengthy amount of time trying to convince him of certain things that he felt weren't really very complimentary, we might say, of his current perspectives on the UAP issue. Namely, one of those issues had been involving the now famous 2004 USS Nimitz incident involving the so-called Tic Tac. We've got jellyfish, we've got Tic Tac, who knows what's coming next. But specifically, Gallaudet said that he felt like he was trying to, or rather the AARO officials were trying to encourage him to consider more down-to-earth possibilities for what the Tic Tac might have been, namely that it could be some kind of U.S. technology. Now, for Gallaudet, the issue he seemed to have taken with that, as expressed during the hearing the other day, was that this undermines what he believes is the testimony, and he believes to be very credible testimony. I would agree with him on that point. But testimony provided by the primary witnesses, Dave Fravor and, of course, Alex Dietrich, and also the other aircraft operators, the Wizzos on board those FA-18 Super Hornets at the time, who directly observed this object. And then later also, of course, we had another Wizzo, the weapon systems operator on board these FA-18s, Chad Underwood, who filmed famously with the Raytheon at-FLIR targeting pod. He filmed the so-called Tic Tac. What we see in that video, Underwood says, and based on his monitoring it with the equipment array, the sensory array there on board the aircraft, and also based on the observations by Dietrich and Fravor, they all seem to believe and agree that this craft, whatever it was not operating like any kind of known aircraft in the U.S. arsenal. But what it was doing was it was actively jamming the radar and basically maintaining an ability, I think what some Lou Elizondo and others have called low observability. It was using signature management to make itself harder to track, harder to visualize, and it was jamming their radars. And as Chad Underwood said at the time, for an unknown craft to be doing that in U.S. restricted airspace, controlled airspace, I should say, off the coast of California, which was used for these training operations, to be doing that in that kind of airspace with military aircraft that are actively trying to pursue this object, whatever it was effectively an act of war. So the problem would seem to be, and I take it probably that Rear Admiral Gallaudet would share this contention, if all of these pilots are saying this was effectively an act of war, if it indeed involved a craft of unknown origin, and we weren't told that this was something of ours, something in the U.S. military's inventory, maybe a secret technology, and there was some sort of experiment being carried out, that in itself, even if it's our technology, that would be a problem. And so Gallaudet felt that to assert that that might be what this was, unfairly perhaps undermines the testimony provided by those pilots. Now, to me, I find it really strange, Cristina, that AARO, if indeed this is what happened during this meeting, and I have no reason really to doubt Tim Gallaudet, but I find it very strange that he would be brought in and that the officials at the All-domain Anomaly Resolution Office, who are currently trying to resolve unknowns in our airspace, they would try to tell a former high-ranking U.S. official this might have been our technology. What really is going on there? And that's one of the most bizarre things, frankly, that came out of this entire hearing to me.
It's pretty gutsy, if you ask me, to say, Mr. Rear Admiral, what you saw, nah, it wasn't what you saw. It was something so, you know what? It was Starlink. That's what it was, okay? Could you imagine? Like, that takes guts to say something like that to a person with the background that he has, the credentials that he has, and the interest as well when it comes to UFOs and USOs. So I think it was missed by a lot of people. I'm really glad that you brought it up here today because it's really going to preface this report that we're going to get into. But we've kind of seen this since the beginning, since the creation of the UAPTF, the AOIMSG, and AARO. We're seeing this consistency that it's just the little brother of Project Blue Book, of attempting to explain everything away. But this time around with AARO, they are receiving witnesses. And from our understanding, from those that have spoken to Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick, the witnesses they weren't taken seriously. And now with this new chief, according to Gallaudet, if Gallaudet was the one that spoke to John, and you said his last name much better than I did, so I'm going to let you say his last name. It seems like we're just rehashing it all over again. So based off of what we know now about AARO, about the new chief, which is very limited, by the way, he only gave John, what's his last name?
Kozlowski, I believe, yeah.
Kozlowski, yes. Wow.
You got it.
You gotta say it with an accent, right? Well, he gave his very first roundtable to the DoD a year after receiving his position. If you try finding him online, you will hardly come across anything aside from like his DoD background about page. That's about it. You can't really find him anywhere else. And for me, it's remarkable that Kirkpatrick was a little bit more in the limelight. He was definitely out there giving information, but this new guy, we don't know anything about him aside from this report and the transcript that we received earlier today from the DoD of the roundtable that he gave yesterday behind closed doors. I'm a little shocked about that.
Yeah, I am. Now I will say this. I have a lot of, colleagues who in various walks of life. I mean, from journalists to scientists to also former, I almost said Ministry of Defense. Which country are we in? Former officials here from the United States and people who have, some knowledge of the UAP issue. Based on my interactions with some of those former officials, many of them did know Kozlowski before his appointment to AARO. And I'll just say I've heard very good things about Dr. Kozlowski. And in fact, I think that based on the kinds of things I've heard, based on his background, which actually is provided in a biography page about him that you can now find there on the Department of Defense website, defense.gov. I believe it's on the DoD website. And if not there, you'll certainly find it on AARO's official page, aaro.mil. But based on what information is available about Dr. Kozlowski and what's been conveyed to me from others who have worked with him in the past, I personally have, I think I would say, cautiously renewed hopes about how the office of AARO will proceed with its investigations. And this is a controversial position that I'm about to express because I realize that there are a lot of, issues that people have toward the, former director, Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick, whom I have also scrutinized in the capacity of my work as a journalist. I mean, that's really what I have to do. I have to look at what government officials or whomever else, are doing and saying, and I have to try and look at that fairly objectively and try to provide accurate information about them. What we can state as fact is that under Dr. Kirkpatrick, there were problems with AARO, which included a very erroneously let me turn this a little differently. The AARO historical report was a little less than factual on all fronts. Let's put it that way. That report, and in fact, the factual issues in the report, several, incorrect dates, incorrect names, other issues, things that had been taken from past studies and had basically just kind of been repurposed and repeated in the AARO report, but which had not been thoroughly analyzed and fact-checked, and therefore some inconsistencies, some problems, some inaccuracies were carried over. There were a lot of issues with that AARO historical report. Unfortunately, the publication of a report that was so rife with issues seemingly undermined the efforts of the office. And therefore, when I have scrutinized what AARO has done, it has been to explicitly point out issues that I think not only were apparent in their publications, but also in some circumstances in the apparent demeanor and behavior of, again, its leadership. That all said, I also do not think, and this is the controversial part that some might find unpopular, I don't disagree with all of AARO's findings, and I actually commend, especially early on, shortly after the office was founded, I commend the amount of information that was being released by AARO, which gave us a whole lot of, a lot more depth of understanding of the different shapes and types, the frequency of UAP sightings, radio emissions that were being apparently detected from these objects, the most common morphologies associated with them. That was all really hopeful. And so as AARO started off, I think, pretty promising, toward the end of Dr. Kirkpatrick's tenure, there were more and more of these problems, including and really truly culminating in the historical report. So that's why I say that, I'm not going to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but I think a lot of people, faith was undermined. We lost a lot of confidence in what AARO was doing. And that our good mutual friend Jimmy Church and I he and I have not always agreed on this. He's always said, look, AARO is not that office. These aren't the droids we're looking for. Don't expect real good, solid UFO information to come out of this office. And I've always said I remain hopeful that we will learn some new things. Although faith was undermined and we were a little disappointed by the end of the last leadership with the new appointment of Dr. Kozlowski, based on things I've heard, I'm cautiously optimistic. Yet again, I want to see where things go. Now, taking all that into consideration and looking at the new report that dropped yesterday, not only is it lengthier, not only do we actually have indications that there is ongoing analysis, a pretty significant number of reports now in collection, and also more explicit descriptions of the appearance and behavior of some of these phenomena when compared with the last report, which would have been the first one that came out under the tenure of Dr. Kirkpatrick. This new report does seem to be, although keep in mind, it reflects on data that was being collected mostly, I would say, probably before Kozlowski came into his new position. So we're still dealing with data that's been collected over a period going back many months. In fact, that actual period is described right there in the report near the first page. We're still seeing, I think, production of material that is better than what we've seen the last couple of times around. Maybe not quite as revealing as that 2021 ODNI report, which a lot of people, when that one came out, they said, look, this is a nothing burger. To me, it's significant in itself that the United States government, a Pentagon office tasked with studying UAP, is producing regular reports like this and saying there are things we can't identify that are following aircraft. These things sometimes resemble, according to those who have seen them, jellyfish, green fireballs, or little rocket or missile-shaped things. Some of these things are disc-shaped. Some of these things are just strange lights that hover or that sometimes pace aircraft. All these kinds of things being referenced in this new report, that to me is quite significant.
I'm with you on that one. And I think that there was some good information in this. But to ask you, what do you think was the biggest takeaway from this article before we kind of touch on a few of these paragraphs here?
AARO, and I'll quote from a portion of this, it says they resolved 49 cases during the most recent reporting period. And they, of course, say that a lot of these things can be determined to have been prosaic objects. They also go on to say an additional 243 cases were recommended for closure as of June 1st, 2024. The remaining 444 cases lack sufficient data, so they say there's not really much we can do with those. But then reading a little further into the details they provide, they say AARO is still working closely with its intelligence community and science and technology partners to understand and attribute 21 cases received in this reporting period that merit further analysis based on reported anomalous characteristics and or behaviors. Now, yet again, a lot of people just kind of gloss over that, Cristina, and they say, okay, great, there's 21 reports they're still trying to work with. Let's break this down a little bit. And I'll tell you why this is really significant. When you have 21 reports, 21 cases received during this reporting period, that means that within the last period of collection, they are not talking about reports that, again, in the terminology as I interpret it, okay, so they're saying reports received during this period. It is presumably possible that some of these reports may have involved circumstances that occurred prior to the reporting period. They may have actually occurred years ago, but the reports were received by AARO during the most recent reporting period, spanning the time between the issuance of the last report and up until about just a few months ago, I believe, based on the wording in the new report. In any case, 21 of these reports are that recent. They have been received recently, and they seem to describe objects that merit further analysis based on reported anomalous characteristics and or behaviors. It is possible that these 21 cases might have just been stories that military personnel told AARO about things that they witnessed or observed. But I would have to imagine that if we have 444 other cases that lack sufficient data to facilitate analysis, how could someone just telling a story provide enough data for sufficient analysis? That's the other thing about these 21 that really has to be taken into consideration. These merit additional investigation, unlike 444, where there just wasn't enough data. So presumably, if my interpretation is correct, there's probably going to be sensor data associated with some, at least, of these 21 cases that are undergoing further analysis and review by AARO, which is really intriguing because often we hear from intelligence officials, and in fact, some of them testifying on Capitol Hill just this week, that, there's better videos out there than what the public has seen. The ones that were leaked to the New York Times back in 2017, there are better videos than those. We often hear that there are other incidents that maybe involve multiple sensor detections. And yes, AARO and its predecessor organization, the UAP Task Force, both of those offices have issued statements along those lines in the past. Multi-sensor detections of anomalous objects that are not easily understood. And furthermore, that in 2021, the UAP Task Force analysts said may require additional advancements in science before we can fully understand exactly how these things, whatever they are operating. So when I see them saying 21 cases that we are still analyzing and that we're still scrutinizing to try and understand exactly how whatever these things are function, that to me says a lot. It seems to say we've got good data on 21 cases and we still can't resolve what the objects were that were seen in those 21 cases. We're working on it. We don't have any evidence of extraterrestrial technologies, but there are things that we are observing and we're collecting data about that we still can't figure out. That to me is huge.
That's a really good point, and I really like that optimism there as well. Something else that we saw in this report is their mention of the Gremlin. We've known about this very vaguely earlier this year, and we really just got their name and knowing it was going to be collecting data on UFOs. Now, I've gotten a bit more details on what this piece of equipment is that is being funded by the government and in some ways how it'll work. We just don't know where it is going to be located because according to John, the new chief of AARO, he mentioned that he doesn't want people to mess around with it in order to create false data, which we're going to get into just a little bit as the report does show a graph on that. There's actually a handful of graphs and pretty pictures here that some might classify as eye candy and kind of irrelevant, while others say, no, this is actually pretty good. But one thing that I want to mention here is in the hearing that we got on Wednesday, it was asked twice of are there any UFO hotspots in and around the ocean? And they were directed towards Rear Admiral Tim Gallaudet. Under oath, he said no, he wasn't aware. According to this report, they mentioned that there are East Asian seas were the hottest spots, providing 100 reports, of which AARO resolved 40 as balloons or drones, but leaving 60 kind of in the category of unknown. And what I find remarkable here is that this report just came out the day after the hearing. And so I wish that these panelists were slightly in the know of what was going on so they could be safe to answer that question. I'm disappointed that they didn't say it was in and around Catalina Island or off the coast of California. That's one of the biggest hotspots that we know of. But for the East Asian seas to be in that report, I didn't expect that, honestly. Did you?
So references to the East Asian seas, one might interpret to mean that basically in the Indo-Pacific region. I think we have to also remember that when we're talking about unidentified anomalous phenomena, the Department of Defense does not explicitly lead with the presumption that we are talking about exotic phenomena. In fact, it really should be driven home that they are looking at any and all phenomena that are not readily explainable, but which may represent one of a few things. A national security threat to the United States, and that could be either a overt or direct threat. That could also be what we might call like a passive threat. I don't know if really that's the best term for it, but what I mean is a surveillance technology, some sort of intelligence gathering operation or platform being used by a foreign adversary. So if we're talking about, again, the region in question and the preponderance of phenomena that occur in oceanic environments or perhaps in the airspace above them, one would have to be concerned about the potential that U.S. operations in the Indo-Pacific maybe are subject to some kind of surveillance, and that this might involve something along the lines of balloons, drones, or other kinds of maybe even as of yet unknown surveillance platforms, but nonetheless which some personnel are observing and encountering, and that AARO has been tasked with trying to resolve. Now, although I am in a roundabout way getting to the idea that, we may be being subjected to surveillance by China or Russia, and that might be one interpretation of what that's referring to in the report. I think it should also be pointed out that of the good UAP reports that are being described in the report, they also say that none of those which AARO is currently still trying to evaluate have been conclusively linked to foreign actors. And so while the possibility remains, and we have to accept that AARO, that is part of their mission to determine whether or not the U.S. is being surveilled by other foreign powers and potentially adversary nations, again, they're also saying we aren't detecting any evidence that strongly points to that. So it's an interesting kind of conundrum that we find ourselves in, where in some of the reporting areas, and you look on the map that they include in the recent report, again, it's very clear that we're seeing in the Middle East and in certain other areas in the world where obviously we have a environment where if there's going to be surveillance being undertaken against the United States and its forces, these are very likely to be places where it happens. And further, AARO has said since its previous directorship under Sean Kirkpatrick, and Sean said this often, there is a reporting bias that is depicted in this imagery. In other words, the little map that shows the heat map where you see the concentrations of areas where UAP sightings occur, those are not really, and AARO leadership has said this themselves, those are not really places where more UAP sightings occur. Those are areas close to U.S. military operations or installations where collection apparatus, sensors, and other capabilities that are able to detect UAP happen to be. And therefore, data about UAP is being collected in those areas. But again, that's what they mean when they talk about that reporting bias. Just because we happen to be collecting more UAP data because we have the capability of observing them near where our military operations are being carried out in various parts of the world does not necessarily mean that there are more UAP in those areas. And this brings us to an important point, really, that was raised during the hearing this week. Former counterintelligence agent Lou Elizondo was asked explicitly by one of the representatives, are there more UAP sightings over high security facilities in the United States? And Lou said that yes, that does seem to be the case. And again, I would have to agree with Mr. Elizondo on that point. I mean, one cannot deny the preponderance of data that's been collected about sightings of UAP near military sites, nuclear sites, especially along the northern tier back during the late 60s and throughout the mid-1970s. This kind of information has been documented for decades by researchers like Barry Greenwood and Lawrence Fawcett in their book, Clear Intent. It was later republished, by the way, under a title called The UFO Cover-Up, and you can still grab that on Amazon. People should definitely read it. And it's an eye-opener. I mean, it's a book full of government documents collected over several decades, many of which do describe UAP sightings near high security facilities. But there was also analysis more recently done by the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies, and it asked the question, well, here again, are we seeing evidence of a reporting bias? Are there more UFO sightings over these military facilities? Or is it just that there are military personnel who are on watch and part of their job is to scan the skies and to be looking for these things, and they happen to observe UAP doing things near these facilities? I would say it's probably both. It would be hard to argue against the idea that a UFO hovering over a nuclear site and seemingly displaying, as the title of the book conveyed, clear intent in doing so. Here I am. What am I doing? That's for you to figure out. But my lights are all turned on and you can clearly see me. They don't appear to be trying to hide. Again, this sentiment, I think, echoed by Mr. Elizondo on Capitol Hill on Wednesday. They don't seem to worry about the fact that they're seen, and it's obvious that they are seen in these locations. Do we see UFOs elsewhere? Yeah, sure, we absolutely do. Can we deny that some of them very clearly appear to be interested in our military operations? That also seems true. So again, looking at the heat map and the AARO report and interpreting, okay, are we having more sightings in certain parts of the world? What about the East Asian oceans, or what about, military sites in the Middle East or whatever? Again, taking all the data and looking at it, all we can really interpret from what AARO is saying is, yeah, there are a preponderance of sightings. There could be trends associated with UAP behaviors and things, but that we can't infer, Cristina, because we don't have access to all that data. It's all kind of glossed over, and there's this watered down version of that that's provided in this short summary report. One would really have to imagine that AARO has a whole lot more data about this, and as conservatively worded as what we see in this report. I mean, if you or I were shown the hundreds of reports that AARO has, and we had, complete access to those, and we could go through them, we could read, I have to feel like I would probably learn a whole lot more about this phenomenon, but it would also probably mirror things, the likes of which we've been hearing for decades. And I don't know that I'll ever be in the position to be able to see this data, which is frustrating. But again, from what little we can see, I'll just say it seems consistent with past efforts and past observations and trends that have been observed about UAP.
And they received about 1,600 reports. And if we were to get our hands on all of them, it would be a little overwhelming as a one-man band. Now, in this case for AARO, there are a handful of people under them, so they're able to hopefully be organized on how they analyze this data. But looking at these military installations and these UFO encounters, according to the report, there were 18 incidents of, quote, drones. That's just kind of the new term, right? The new brush off term instead of swamp gas or weather balloons, but near U.S. nuclear infrastructure, weapons, and launch sites. And the new chief of AARO said that there are no indication that either those or reported UAPs belong to adversaries. So this really opens the door of, okay, what's really going on? Are they actually drones? Something that was mentioned during the hearing on Wednesday that was asked by Mace is, what about contractors? Are contractors involved in this? What do we know about them? And this was a question pointed to Elizondo, and he's like, I really can't answer that, which then brought in Lockheed Martin, which you brought up a little bit earlier, Micah. But we also have to consider those, unfortunately, those possibilities as well, because these contractors and these private companies do not have to follow the same restrictions as the government when it comes to filing FOIA reports. They don't have to. You can say, give me the information. They can literally tell you no. And there's nothing you can do about it. But when you file your FOIA report to Congress or the government, they're not necessarily like, they're not required to do it, but it looks good on them. And it can take anywhere from a few days to a few decades to receive those reports. But this is the big difference between the government, Congress, and these private corporations and these contractors as well. Something else that was rather interesting is that there's going to be this closed meeting and maybe even an open meeting on November 19th, talking about AARO, maybe them releasing some new UFO footage. Are you in the know, Micah? Do you know things we don't that you can share with us today?
I don't think that I know a significant amount more than what the most diligent researchers out there who have been doing this for decades have learned, or even some of the most in-the-know journalists. I will tell you this, I know more than a lot of people who go on television and present themselves as experts and often allude to knowing more things than everybody else does. And what's really frustrating is when you're sitting there thinking you know more than those people probably do, and that they will tend to blow smoke at times. I won't name names because I have a lot of friends in the community and things along those lines, but you hear about this all the time on social media, the so-called dangling carrot. People always talking about big things coming. We know stuff. We can't tell you. Again, how much any one individual knows is never probably going to be enough when it comes to this subject to have the full picture and to truly understand what it all represents. And for my own part, I'd rather not allude to what we know and what we don't know. I would say let's look at what's publicly available that we can all look at, what we can all process and discern from, and try to piece together a broader, bigger picture that helps us all understand what this phenomena represents. Now, I will say this. Yeah, I do as a journalist talk with people, former officials, and others who provide insight on various aspects of this, ranging from to what extent they can, because these people are patriots. And as a journalist, I 100% will always respect their limitations in terms of what they can or will speak to, and they're honoring their oaths to our government. But what they can teach me and tell me are things about, like, for instance, general intelligence gathering practices, interpretation of technical aspects of, for instance, videos and imagery and things along those lines, certain operational capabilities that might be in use with some technologies without indicating the full scope of how technologies are used, for instance, to gather information about our enemies. That's the kind of information that is not released. This is the kind of information when it comes to UFOs that the government doesn't want to release, because they don't want our enemies to know how we collect this data. They don't want them to thereby be able to effectively spoof these capabilities. For instance, let's say we've got really good sensors, and China or Russia realizes that we're detecting UFOs with certain parameters on those systems. And it gives China and Russia, based on what we release about a UFO video, a good idea of the range of those sensors, a good idea about, what kinds of frequencies, radio, and, what have you, that an object might not only broadcast, but how those sensors detect that. if China or Russia knows these things and they say, cool, okay, the US, they're out there operating in the Pacific Ocean and on their aircraft carriers, they have those sensors, and we know now what the range is, what kinds of things they're looking for, and that those kinds of sensors were useful in detecting these weird little objects. We don't know what those things are, but what we do know is how we can avoid those sensors now because we have a better idea of how they work. So this is one of the reasons that information isn't released. But coming back to your question about, do I know if there are videos or things coming out? I've heard nothing about that. What I have heard about is that there are better videos that do exist. And I've continually heard this from people, but that the discussion of those videos and specifics about what they seem to convey falls under that, well, we can't really talk about that because, especially even if some of these videos are not classified, some of them, many of them, in fact, as I understand it, are probably just unclassified, but they're designated what's known as for special use. I believe that the 3 historic Navy videos, the Tic Tac, Go Fast, and what was the other one? Have Fleer, or actually the first one's Fleer, so it's Go Fast, Gimbal, and Fleer, right? Those 3, I believe, were unclassified, but they were for special use. And that's how they were effectively leaked. You may recall that there was also an investigation conducted, I believe, by the Air Force Office of Special Investigation into those. They didn't find that any laws were broken. That's why they weren't classified. But nonetheless, people who have knowledge of the existence of additional videos often do not discuss what's in those videos for all these reasons I've stated. But I can still assure you, despite not having any inside information about any forthcoming videos, let's call this a prediction. I can almost assure you that you're going to see more videos coming directly from AARO in the fairly near future. And by near future, I would say the next maybe 4 weeks to 6 months. Now, let me tell you why I know that. Because we already have a history of AARO doing exactly that. AARO has been pretty good, in fact, about producing resolution reports where when they have analyzed sometimes what looks like very compelling video or imagery, and they have conducted their investigations, when and where they are able to release visuals in association with those investigations that does not compromise national security by revealing things about sensor capabilities, AARO has released those videos. The problem is, in all cases except for only a couple, they have shown us videos of things that ended up being very normal objects like distant aircraft, birds, frankly, not very interesting things to people who are really interested in possible anomalies like you and I. The 2 notable instances that have, to me, stood out and which may not represent knowns that were simply misidentified were, 1, the Middle East sphere, that orb-like object that was metallic in appearance that Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick first revealed, I believe, during an April 2023 Senate hearing overseen by a New York Senator Kirsten Gillibrand. That's an interesting one, and although it remains unidentified, there's not a whole lot of data we can really discern from that. Although I will say there was a very interesting analysis I think that Bellingcat did and posted online that seemed to show a plausible explanation for why they thought it was simply a balloon hovering stationary and that it was the movement of the drone causing the so-called parallax effect that gave the impression of a moving object. The most intriguing one from the AARO resolution cases, however, is the so-called incident that had occurred down there off the Florida Panhandle coast some time ago. We had this Eglin Air Force Base incident, as some refer to it. The case resolution on that one was unsatisfactory, at very least, to me. The images of the object, which AARO said with moderate confidence was most likely a lighting balloon, a commercial lighting balloon, did not look like the lighting balloon that they said it was. And I'm not the only person that holds that view. I'll note that skeptic Mick West had also said the same thing. And in fact, in a piece we did for the debrief, I interviewed Mick and I said, Mick, what do you think about AARO's analysis? And he says, I think AARO could do better. The thing, whatever the thing is in the photograph, does not look like a lighting balloon like they say it is. Now, sure, we all know Mick is a skeptic. He probably doesn't think that's anything anomalous. But the point was, and the most important thing to me is, Mick was not really very, very much in line with AARO's determination about that object. I mean, he even said this thing looks like something. I think he likened it to like a beach ball with a toboggan or a hat on, as opposed to the commercial lighting balloon AARO said it was. So he said AARO really should do better. I agree. And if there's something that skeptics and UAP proponents can find common ground on and agree, and furthermore, that what we agree on is that some of the case resolutions that AARO has published saying we're pretty confident, moderately so, that that's what this is, we're not convinced, that should be a problem in itself. And again, I think it's important when skeptics and proponents can rally together on common issues. But when your common issue is that the government's investigations aren't good enough, that in itself should be a problem. But at the end of the day, what is in those photographs that the pilot that was operating there around Eglin Air Force Base, photographed? What is the object? I don't know. I think, however, skeptical analysis and that of UAP proponents gives us a strong indication that the government's determination was pretty unsatisfactory. And yes, that could actually be a genuine unknown. So will there be more videos released? If past is prologue, we can certainly say we've already seen a few and that AARO does pretty reliably issue those from time to time. The next time they issue one, and this is really important, no matter what the case resolution status is, I think that there is precedent for scrutinizing that. And I think that we should always be a little cautious. Don't say that everything is really an alien spacecraft and the AARO is always wrong. But again, there is precedent for being a little cautious about accepting all of their conclusions. Some of these things may still remain effectively unidentified anomalous phenomena, not case resolved, as AARO has said.
I'm with you on that one. Being skeptical is so important. We just simply cannot believe everything that we hear or read, or we trust one person. We say, oh my gosh, that's the gospel right there. We simply can't do that. And this is a very remarkable topic to be researching and studying, but it's also heavily known for disinformation and misinformation as well. I do want to state this, that I did find very interesting that John, the chief of AARO, had mentioned during the roundtable, is that Congress has enabled us, AARO, to receive all sensitive information regardless of classification or NDAs that the witnesses might have signed. And we receive that information and we follow up on every tip that they provide us. This is remarkable, and yet I can't stop thinking about Tim Gallaudet and the thing that he said at the hearing of, I spoke to them, but they tried to make me sound like I'm low-key crazy and that what I saw wasn't anything out of this world. It was pretty mundane. So I'm having mixed feelings about that right there. But something that, because we only have like 15 minutes left. Can you believe that?
Time flies.
About always with you. We got to talk about this right here, the Gremlin, and I'm just going to fix this up just a little bit. Here it is. Okay. How do I zoom this in? All right. What, Micah, you have better eyeballs than you do. You have a better prescription. What are we looking at right here?
So what you're looking at is essentially a infographic that describes in general terms how the new Gremlin network stack, or the so-called Gremlin sensory array, functions. Now, for those who are wondering what Gremlin is essentially a sensor package that AARO is currently still experimenting with. It was designed to be a rapidly deployable sensor capability that can be used for the detection of UAP. As you can see, it describes, again, if they're trying to keep from us exactly everything that it can do, it's telling us an awful lot in this infographic about what the Gremlin sensor is designed to do. And really, this is, if you want to put it in very simple terms, this is a scientific UFO researcher's dream. Because let's just go down the list here. We've got, first of all, the network stack, which is essentially the kind of the control hub. And then we have, again, the line that goes up to all these different sensor capabilities that range from starting at 12 o'clock right there, long range, electro-optical and infrared detection capabilities, SATCOM or satellite communications capabilities, 2D search radar. You've got a cellular uplink, copper fiber link, 2D search radar. Again, you'll notice that there are actually 3 of those and then also one 3D radar. You've got a radio frequency spectrum monitor, a long-range electro-optical and infrared monitor. You've got a GPS capability right there, and then an ADS-B up there. All of this attached to a central control hub. In very simple layman's terms, what you have is you have multi-sensory detection capabilities, all feeding information back to a central control hub that can be monitored so that you can be observing a wide range of information coming in from an environment and determining in not only, for instance, if a UAP is emitting radio frequencies and all you detect is a radio frequency. Let's say, okay, cool, an anomalous radio frequency of unknown origin, that's cool by itself. The use of multiple instruments is not simply to be able to detect any little thing that may show up. They're hoping, of course, that they will have multi-sensor capabilities where, okay, we see an object, we're filming it, we can't see it visually, but we detected it in the the infrared with one of our long-range electro-optical and infrared detectors right there. Okay, cool. Let's see if we can also detect this thing on radar. Sure enough, we've got infrared imagery and we've also got it on radar. Let's see if there are any radio frequency emissions. So the RF spectrum monitor is detecting radio frequencies. Okay, let's narrow in and see exactly what frequency band it's operating on. What frequencies are we detecting coming from this object? You can see how they could be detecting a whole lot of things from an object with this new Gremlin sensor array, and all of that information being processed by a central hub and collected and then later made available for analysis as a data package that can be analyzed and maybe also contained within future reports. Now, I doubt, of course, that information is going to be released by AARO. They don't want this information getting out. And as you pointed out, Dr. Kozlowski has already said so much. He wants to be very careful about how much information about the control capabilities, the parameters that are being monitored on each instrument, et cetera, gets out because he's afraid that someone might potentially try to spoof this system. But that all said, this is what Gremlin is designed to do: multi-sensor detection and monitoring of anomalous phenomena in a rapidly deployable, in other words, basically a system that can be put on board an aircraft, flown out, taken to a location, maybe even actually just used remotely from a moving aircraft or from another kind of a control surface, maybe one at sea on board a sailing vessel, maybe one on board some kind of land-based vehicle. Gremlin is basically designed to be taken with the military into various environments and for use in various applications in multi-sensor detection and analysis of UAP on the spot in real time, right? So again, this is like a UFO researcher's dream. What I think scientists in the past, some have tried to design. I mean, we look at notable examples like UFO Hub and the UFO Data Project and some others. Also, there was a short-lived initiative called Sky Hub, which was primarily a visual system. But again, there have been some public iterations of this. One of the more notable, not simple at all. It's a very similar system that's being used by academics. Is the Galileo Project's observatory there at Harvard University, and that initiative being led by Dr. Avi Loeb. And this is interesting because this week, with all the UAP issue information that has been coming out of Capitol Hill and Washington, it almost got glossed over that the Galileo Project has released its first batch of commissioning data on its observations from the Galileo Project Observatory. So in the midst of the hearings, the recent AARO report, all the new information about the Gremlin system and the testing that's still underway with this sensor suite, the Galileo Project has a similar array of materials and sensor capabilities that they're using to monitor the environment up at Harvard University. They're hoping to be able to design similar observatories and place those in various strategic locations and continue to collect data from all of those observatories. But again, that information, the initial commissioning data that they have produced, that came out this week too. So one might argue this has been a huge week and one of the most exciting weeks this entire year for UAP research, not only in terms of government, but also in terms of academic institutions. And I'm really glad to see that on multiple fronts, this kind of equipment is being implemented in the study of this phenomena, because like I said, AARO may not be able to release their data that the Gremlin system will be collecting. That won't be the case with the Galileo project. And if indeed Dr. Loeb and his colleagues collect data with that, you can rest assured that there will be science papers that are submitted for peer review. That data will be made available to the public. And here again, we find that the truth about UAP may not come from government disclosure, but in fact, data collected by scientists who are taking up the case, and they're working on this right now.
And one of Dr. Avi Loeb's mottos is that the sky isn't classified. He really works for the public's interest of, he wants the information, we want the information, he has the funding for it and the big brains. He'll be the one to provide that information to the public. So it would be interesting to see what he finds, where his data takes him, because he is not led by bias. And again, just based off of what Tim Gallaudet had said about AARO, they're on the bias side, it seems. They want to explain everything away to the best of their ability, just like what Project Blue Book did. The Galileo project is just a little bit different. And with this Gremlin piece of technology, to my understanding, it is portable, a little larger than a backpack, I believe, something along those lines. We shared that information in March. But correct me if I'm wrong. That's okay. But I know that it is a portable piece of technology, so I think it's going to be great for military officials to be using in the future. And then for the Galileo project, if they have something similar that's also portable, it would be great if it would become a commercial piece of equipment where anyone can buy it, kind of like the Sky Hub, and collect their own data. That would be rather remarkable. But I think out of this report, the Gremlin might have been one of the biggest takeaways, like one of the best pieces of information for the public to be aware of what's going on, how developments are going. Because aside from that, the rest of the report is this is explainable, this is explainable, this is what we know. And that's the information that the general public doesn't really want, but AARO has to provide that information to Congress in order to continue receiving that funding that they need in order to collect data and to provide that data out to the public. So I'm looking forward to November 19th for their closed hearing. Maybe we'll get some information off of that, and their supposed open hearing where we might receive some new videos from them. I look forward to it, but honestly, I don't have high hopes, and I can imagine it being postponed for sure.
Yeah. One thing I will say is that I'm kind of afraid that many in the general public have been conditioned to expect that if there's any important UAP information, it's got to be sensational, groundbreaking. It has to involve whistleblowers, and it has to involve sources who are saying very, very controversial things about the government and what none of us are allowed to know, and what even presidents in the past haven't been told. Look, in my view, we have to unmarry ourselves and our minds and our hearts from the expectation that all meaningful information about UFOs is going to have to be sensational. It's going to have to be earth-shattering, paradigm-shifting, because sometimes the most important data, it's not something that will necessarily be sexy or attractive, at least looking at it, in general terms. And in science, that's usually how it goes. You think about all of the astrophysical data that we collect about the cosmos. And, to the average Joe looking at it on a computer, we might go, okay, there's a bunch of ones and zeros, right? But to an astrophysicist who is trained to understand how that system works and to understand what kind of data they're looking at, they may be looking at, groundbreaking insights into the nature of time and space, or the continuity between them, information about, what's happening with black holes and how this plays a role in the formation of galaxies. This may be giving us information about the ever elusive dark matter and dark energy. And again, it's data and collecting data. And again, experimentation that leads to observations of again, I think real world phenomena that can be studied, they can be quantified, they can be reported in scientific papers that undergo proper peer review, and that clearly illustrate and demonstrate, often in very simple terms, but based on a wealth of data that has to be properly vetted and reviewed, that there are phenomena occurring in the universe that, again, the average person looking at the night sky might not be able to discern. Again, these don't seem like massive revelations, but they are fundamental to our understanding of the cosmos. Science works in that way, and I think that if we really want to understand UAP, we have to start looking at UAP in similar terms. The big revelations about this phenomenon probably are not going to be paradigm shifting, sensational news stories and things along those lines. I mean, Dr. Loeb again said, and I'm a journalist, but I have to agree with him. He said probably journalists and lawmakers on Capitol Hill and people like that, they're not going to be the ones who bring about, the truth about UAP. It's not going to come through these kinds of disclosure channels. Now, some of it may. For all you or I know, Cristina, maybe that will be how we learn the truth about UFOs. I would argue, though, that Dr. Loeb is probably right. It will be scientists collecting data on this phenomenon just like any other phenomenon. And that data may seem really boring to the average person, but again, to scientists who really study it and who understand how do we process this, what do we do with this, how do we apply the accumulation of our knowledge of the physical universe toward this phenomenon, and what does that reveal about these new phenomena that for a long time people have said that they saw but we couldn't understand. That's going to be the path forward. And it's not always going to be sensational revelations. So I do think that we should unmarry ourselves from the idea that only sensation sells. And when it comes to UFOs, if it's not a great big controversy, if it's not some sort of a incredible claim coming from a government insider, it doesn't matter. trust me, the most meaningful data that we will find about UAP and the things that I think will advance our understanding of them are probably going to come from those humble scientists peering through telescopes.
And when those scientists drop those report, we're going to need someone to translate for us. And the best person is the guy right here, Micah Hanks, and you can find him at the Debrief or the Micah Hanks program as well. Can you believe this hour flew by so quickly? I was like, we have more to talk about. But we know you have to get going. You have other things to do. So before you head out, where can people find you?
I'm pretty easy to find. Just go on, like you said, micahhanks.com. I've got my weekly podcast I put out there. And I am the editor and also one of the primary science contributors there at thedebrief.org. So my team and I are always putting out information on a range of topics in the sciences, but we also cover UAP quite a bit. And, as far as time goes, we're always running out of it. And that may be one thing to consider. We should really look into time travel. I understand some of my listeners have reached out to you about that because I used to have a time machine. I loaned it to Cristina Gomez and I never got it back. If you want more time, you're going to have to return my TARDIS one of these days, young lady.
It's no joke. He mentioned that. And then I got an email the next day of like, are you going to return Micah's TARDIS? And I'm like, who are you? Why are you this to me? Yeah. I was very confused. And then it finally made sense after I told Micah. He's like, no, I brought you up. And I'm like, oh my goodness. And I thought I was crazy or something. But Micah, thank you so much. His article on the summary of the AARO report will be in the description box below, along with his website, so you can find it right there. That is it for today. I will see you next time. Be safe. And remember, keep your eyes on the skies. If you enjoy the strange and the mysterious, UFOs, the paranormal, and cryptids, this channel is for you. So make sure to subscribe as I do 3 videos right here every single week, and hit that notification bell so you do not miss any of the bonus content I post right here.